The gavel slammed, and Karoline Leavitt was ordered into custody for daring to question a judge's ruling. She stood silently, her calm unshaken, while the courtroom whispered her guilt. But no one knew her mentor, a legal titan, was watching from the shadows. Why would a young woman risk everything for a few numbers? And what truth was she hiding? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The air in room 4 of the Virginia Federal Courthouse hung heavy, thick with the scent of polished wood and old paper. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer slightly creased from hours of waiting, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles paled. She was 32, but in that moment, she felt smaller, younger, like a child caught in a storm she didn't start. Judge Douglas Whitaker's gavel had just slammed down, its echo still ringing in her ears. His voice, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the room. "Ms. Leavitt, your disregard for this court is unacceptable. Marshals, take her into custody." The words landed like a punch, stealing her breath. She didn't move, didn't blink, but inside her heart raced, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. The gallery behind her, reporters, clerks, and curious onlookers gasped, their whispers rising like a tide. A marshal, broad-shouldered with a face carved from stone, stepped forward, his handcuffs catching the fluorescent light. They glinted, cold and final. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his high-backed chair, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom's harsh lights. At 64, he carried the weight of decades on the bench, his stern glare a badge of authority. He'd called Karoline arrogant earlier, his lips curling around the word as if it tasted sour. She dared to question his ruling on her alleged falsification of federal jobs data, a charge she knew was flimsy, built on misread reports and political grudges. Her work as a press secretary in a conservative administration had made her a target, but she hadn't expected this, a contempt of court order, a public shaming. "You think you're above the law, Ms. Leavitt," Whitaker had said, his voice low but venomous. She hadn't answered, not out of defiance, but because her throat felt sealed shut, her words trapped behind a wall of disbelief. Karoline's eyes darted to the gallery, where reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like insects. A young woman in a gray suit, probably a junior clerk, met her gaze for a fleeting second before looking away, her face unreadable. The other spectators shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, hungry for drama, others staring at their shoes, unwilling to witness her fall. If you've ever stood in a room where every eye judged you, where your name felt like a weight you couldn't carry, this moment was for you. Karoline's mind raced, replaying the months leading here, late nights poring over data, her father's voice in her head, urging her to stand firm. He'd been gone 3 years, but his lessons lingered, steadying her now. The marshal's boots thudded closer, each step a countdown. Karoline's fingers brushed the edge of her blazer, where a small, worn leather notebook rested in her pocket, her father's, inscribed with his initials. It was her anchor, a reminder of who she was beyond this room, beyond Whitaker's scorn. She hadn't spoken out of turn, hadn't raised her voice, but her quiet insistence on the truth had been enough to enrage the judge. He saw her youth, her gender, her past role in a polarizing administration, and decided she was a problem to be silenced. "You're out of chances," he'd said, his tone final, as if she were a child caught lying. But Karoline wasn't lying. The jobs data she'd cited was real, drawn from independent audits, not the government's polished reports. She'd tried to explain, but Whitaker had cut her off, his patience thinning with every word she spoke. The marshal was close now, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the faint tang of his aftershave, could hear the soft jingle of his keys. Her stomach twisted, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning anger. Not at the marshal, he was just doing his job, but at the unfairness of it all. She'd come to this courtroom to defend her work, her integrity. And now she faced handcuffs, her name smeared across news feeds. The reporters in the gallery were already typing, their stories half-written, former press secretary detained in courtroom clash. She imagined her mother reading it, her face crumpling. Karoline swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand taller. She wouldn't cry, wouldn't give Whitaker the satisfaction. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen dropped, the sound sharp in the tense silence. The young clerk in the gray suit shifted, her eyes flickering back to Karoline. Curious now, maybe even sympathetic. The other spectators held their breath, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. Whitaker's gaze bore into her, daring her to resist, to prove his point. But Karoline didn't move, didn't speak. She let the moment stretch, heavy with possibility. Her father's words echoed again. Truth waits, but it never hides. The marshal reached for her wrist, his fingers brushing her sleeve. Was this it? Would she really be led away, her name forever tied to this moment of shame? The room seemed to tilt, every eye fixed on her, waiting for what came next. The fluorescent lights in room 4 of the Virginia Federal Courthouse buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the oak-paneled walls. Karoline Leavitt sat rigid in the defendant's chair, her posture straight but her shoulders heavy, as if carrying an invisible weight. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, gripped a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed from years of handling. It had belonged to her father, a quiet man who'd taught her to measure her words and trust in time. His initials, etched in faded gold, gleamed faintly under her thumb. Judge Whitaker's earlier words still stung, sharp and deliberate. "You're out of your depth, young lady." The phrase echoed in her mind, not because it was true, but because it was meant to wound. Her chest tightened, a familiar ache of humiliation rising. But she didn't flinch, didn't let her face betray the storm inside. At 32, she'd faced worse press conferences where reporters sneered, colleagues who dismissed her as too young, too outspoken. But this, a courtroom, felt different. It was a trap, and she was its prey. In the gallery, rows of wooden benches held a mix of reporters, court staff, and curious locals, their faces a blur of judgment and indifference. A young woman in a gray suit, Emily, sat near the back, her notepad open but her pen still. She was a junior clerk, barely 25, her eyes flickering between Karoline and the judge. Emily's job was to record, to stay invisible. But something about Karoline's stillness drew her attention. The other spectators were less engaged. A man in a cheap suit scrolled on his phone. An older woman adjusted her glasses, avoiding Karoline's gaze. They didn't want to challenge Whitaker's authority, didn't want to be seen siding with a woman already labeled trouble. If you've ever sat in a room where silence felt like betrayal, where no one dared speak for you, this was that moment. Karoline felt their eyes, their quiet complicity, but she didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. Whitaker sat high on his bench, his silver hair catching the light, his fingers drumming softly on a stack of papers. He'd been a judge for decades, a man who thrived on control, his rulings as unyielding as the gavel he wielded. To him, Karoline was an irritation, a young woman who dared to question his interpretation of her job's data report. She'd cited independent audits, not federal numbers, and he'd taken it as a personal affront. "This court doesn't tolerate grandstanding," he'd said earlier, his voice low, almost paternal, as if scolding a child. Karoline hadn't grandstanded. She'd simply asked for clarity, her tone measured, her facts checked. But Whitaker didn't want clarity. He wanted obedience. His contempt order, his call for her arrest, was less about law and more about power. He leaned forward now, his eyes narrowing as he watched her, waiting for a crack in her composure. Karoline traced the edge of her father's notebook, her fingers lingering on its worn leather. It was more than a keepsake. It was a tether to the man who'd raised her to stand firm, even when the world pushed back. "Truth waits, but it never hides," he told her once, his voice steady as they sat on their porch in Richmond, the summer air thick with fireflies. He'd been a data analyst, meticulous and principled, and she'd followed in his footsteps, choosing facts over flash. That choice had led her here, to a courtroom where her integrity was on trial. She thought of her mother, alone at home, probably watching the news, her hands clasped in worry. The thought made Karoline's throat tighten, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't break. Not here. Not now. The marshal stood nearby, his boots scuffing the floor as he shifted his weight. He was waiting for Whitaker's final nod, his handcuffs still in hand, their metal glinting like a promise of shame. Karoline could feel his presence, a shadow at her side. But she didn't look at him. Her calm, her refusal to plead or panic, seemed to unsettle the room. Emily, the clerk, tilted her head slightly, her pen still poised over her notepad. There was something about Karoline, her steady hands, her unbowed head that didn't fit Whitaker's narrative of a reckless troublemaker. The reporters in the gallery scribbled on, their stories already taking shape. But their words couldn't capture the weight of this moment, the way the air seemed to hum with unspoken questions. Karoline's fingers tightened around the notebook, her father's initials pressing into her palm. She thought of the data she'd presented, the hours she'd spent cross-checking numbers, the pride she'd felt in telling the truth. Whitaker had dismissed it as fabrication, but she knew better. The truth was in those pages, in the audits she'd cited, in the work she'd done to honor her father's legacy. She could have shouted, could have argued, but she chose silence, not out of weakness, but because she trusted the truth to find its way. The marshal took a step closer, his shadow darkening her table. Emily's pen twitched, as if she wanted to write something but didn't know what. The room felt heavier, charged with the sense that someone was about to change everything. Who was Karoline, really? And what was she holding back the Virginia Federal Courthouse? Room 4 felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension and the faint hum of overhead lights. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer now slightly rumpled, her hands resting lightly on her father's leather notebook, its worn edges a quiet comfort. Her face burned, not from shame but from the heat of injustice. As the prosecutor, a wiry man named Hargrove, launched his attack, his voice, sharp and laced with contempt, filled the room. "Ms. Leavitt deliberately inflated federal jobs data to mislead the public," he said, pacing before the bench. "She's a political pawn, Your Honor, not a patriot." The words were a blade, meant to cut deep, to paint her as a liar chasing headlines. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue, her gaze steady, fixed on a spot just past Hargrove's shoulder. Inside, her heart pounded, a mix of anger and resolve. She'd spent months on that data, cross-checking every figure, knowing the truth mattered more than applause. But here, truth seemed like an afterthought. Judge Whitaker, perched on his elevated bench, nodded slowly, his silver hair catching the light. His pen tapped impatiently against a stack of documents, a rhythmic tick that grated on Karoline's nerves. At 64, Whitaker carried the weight of authority like a second skin, his rulings rarely questioned, his patience thin. Hargrove's accusation fit neatly into his view of Karoline, a young, outspoken woman who'd stepped out of line. "This court values honesty, not theatrics," he'd said earlier, his tone heavy with judgment. Now. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched her, waiting for her to crumble under Hargrove's words. The gallery behind Karoline stirred, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Reporters typed furiously, their laptops glowing, already spinning the story former press secretary faces contempt in data scandal. A woman in the back adjusted her scarf, her face unreadable, while a man in a wrinkled suit leaned forward, eager for more. Emily, the junior clerk in her gray suit, sat near the gallery's edge, her notepad open but her pen still. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering to Karoline's unshaken posture. There was something about the way Karoline stood calm, almost defiant, despite the storm around her that didn't match Hargrove's portrait of a reckless opportunist. Emily's fingers twitched, as if she wanted to write something but wasn't sure what. If you've ever watched someone be torn down for telling the truth, felt that knot in your stomach when no one speaks up. This was that moment. Karoline felt the weight of the room, the eyes boring into her, the silent agreement that she was guilty before she'd even spoken. But she didn't flinch. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Truth waits, but it never hides. She clung to them, a lifeline in the chaos. Hargrove pressed on, his voice rising as he turned to the judge. Her silence is defiance. Your Honor. She refuses to explain her actions, refuses to respect this court. He gestured toward Karoline, his hand slicing the air. I move for a contempt charge, effective immediately. The gallery gasped, the sound sharp and sudden. Whitaker's pen stopped tapping, his lips curling into a faint, satisfied smile. He leaned back, his chair creaking, and fixed Karoline with a stare that felt like a challenge. Speak, Ms. Leavitt, he said, his voice low, almost a growl, or I'll decide for you. The words hung heavy, a command wrapped in a threat. Karoline's throat tightened, her pulse racing. She wanted to speak, to lay out the facts, the independent audits, the hours of work, the truth behind her numbers. But something held her back, a quiet instinct that this wasn't the moment, not yet. She opened her mouth, her breath catching, but before a word could escape, a faint cough broke the silence, sharp and deliberate, from the back of the gallery. Karoline's eyes darted toward the sound, but she couldn't see who it was. The crowd shifted, heads turning, a ripple of curiosity spreading. Emily, the clerk, leaned forward, her pen finally moving, scribbling something quickly. The marshal, still standing near Karoline, glanced back, his hand pausing on his handcuffs. Even Hargrove faltered, his rhythm broken, his eyes scanning the gallery. Whitaker's brow furrowed, his authority momentarily shaken. The cough wasn't random, it felt like a signal, a crack in the room's tension. Karoline's fingers brushed her father's notebook, her heart steadying. Someone was watching closely, someone who knew more than they let on. She didn't know who, but their presence changed the air, made it hum with possibility. The gallery settled, but the moment lingered, charged with unspoken questions. Karoline stood taller, her gaze returning to Whitaker. She wouldn't speak. Not yet. Not when the room was poised on the edge of something bigger. Hargrove cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but his voice sounded thinner now, less certain. Your Honor, we can't tolerate this, he said. But the words lacked their earlier bite. Whitaker's eyes flicked to the gallery, then back to Karoline, his patience fraying. He raised his gavel, ready to enforce his will. Caroline's breath caught, her mind racing. Who had coughed, and why did it feel like the room was holding its breath, waiting for a truth she hadn't yet revealed? The Virginia Federal Courthouse. Room 4 was a crucible of tension, its oak-paneled walls seeming to close in under the weight of whispered anticipation. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer now clinging to her shoulders, damp with the sweat of a morning that felt like a lifetime. Her hands, steady despite the chaos, rested on her father's leather notebook, its frayed edges a quiet reminder of the man who'd taught her to stand firm. The marshal's fingers were inches from her wrist, his handcuffs gleaming with cold intent, when a voice calm, commanding, and unmistakably familiar cut through the room like a lifeline. "Your Honor, I've filed an emergency stay this morning." "It's on your desk." Caroline's breath caught, her eyes widening as she turned toward the back row. Pam Bondi, the seasoned attorney with steel in her gaze, stood tall, her tailored suit as sharp as her words. The courtroom froze, every eye pivoting to her, the air crackling with surprise. Judge Whitaker's face reddened, a flush creeping up his neck as he fumbled through the papers on his bench. His silver hair, usually impeccable, seemed disheveled under the fluorescent lights, his authority shaken by this sudden intrusion. He'd been moments from sealing Caroline's fate, his contempt order a public rebuke of her quiet defiance. Now, his hands betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, rifling through documents as if searching for an anchor. Pam held up a single sheet, its official seal catching the light, her voice steady as she continued. "Ms. Leavitt's data came from an independent audit, not fabrication. The prosecution's claims are premature." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the gallery. Reporters paused, their pens hovering, spectators leaned forward, their murmurs rising. Emily, the junior clerk in her gray suit, leaned forward too, scribbling furiously, her earlier hesitation replaced by a spark of curiosity. Caroline's heart raced, a mix of relief and disbelief flooding her chest. She hadn't known Pam was involved, hadn't even seen her enter the courtroom. Pam Bondi, her mentor from years ago, when Karoline was just a college intern navigating the cutthroat world of political communications, had always been a force, a woman who wielded law like a blade. They'd lost touch after Karoline took the press secretary role. But Pam's presence now felt like a promise kept, a thread from her past pulling her back from the edge. Caroline's fingers tightened around her father's notebook, her thumb tracing his initials. She thought of the late-night talks with Pam, the advice to trust the truth but fight for it. Had Pam been watching all along, waiting for this moment? The thought steadied her, grounding her in a room that felt ready to spin. Hargrove, the prosecutor, recovered quickly, his sharp features twisting into a sneer. "This is a stunt, Your Honor," he snapped, his voice cutting through the buzz. "Ms. Bondi has no standing here. She's grandstanding to delay the inevitable." He gestured toward Karoline, his hand dismissive, as if she were a minor inconvenience. But his bravado rang hollow. The gallery's attention was on Pam, not him. Whitaker, still rifling through papers, found the stay order and scanned it, his jaw tightening. The document was real, filed at 8:03 m, hours before the session began. He cleared his throat, his voice strained. "This court will take a recess to review the development." The gavel struck, a weak echo of its earlier force, and the room erupted in whispers. Reporters typed frantically, their screens glowing with breaking news. "Bondi intervenes in Leavitt contempt case." Caroline's eyes met Pam's across the room, a fleeting connection that carried years of trust. Pam's nod was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. "I've got you." Caroline's throat tightened, not with fear now, but with a quiet gratitude that felt too big for words. If you've ever felt alone in a fight, only to see someone step forward when you needed them most, this was that moment. Emily, the clerk, glanced at Caroline, her pen slowing, her expression softening. The other spectators shifted, some whispering to neighbors, others staring at Pam, trying to place her. Hargrove stormed to his table, muttering to his assistant, his confidence fraying. Whitaker rose, his robe swishing as he retreated to his chambers. His earlier smugness gone. Caroline sank into her chair, her legs trembling now that the immediate threat had paused. The marshal stepped back, his handcuffs tucked away, his face unreadable. She touched her father's notebook, its leather warm under her fingers, and thought of the audits she'd cited, pages of data she'd verified. Numbers that told a story of real jobs, real lives. Whitaker and Hargrove had dismissed them as lies, but Pam's intervention meant someone believed her. The gallery buzzed, phones lighting up as news spread beyond the courthouse. Caroline's name was trending, her story no longer just hers. But the recess wouldn't last forever, and Whitaker's silence felt like a gathering storm. Pam's stay was a lifeline. But what else did she have planned? And could it turn the tide for good? The Virginia Federal Courthouse. Room 4 hummed with restless energy during the recess, its oak-paneled walls absorbing the soft clatter of laptops and the rustle of papers. Karoline Leavitt sat at the defendant's table, her navy blazer now slightly askew, her hands still wrapped around her father's leather notebook, its worn edges a quiet anchor. The air felt lighter than it had all morning, but her chest still carried a weight, a mix of hope and caution. Pam Bondi's emergency stay had paused the marshal's handcuffs, but the courtroom remained a battlefield, and Caroline knew the fight was far from over. Across the room, Pam stood at a small podium, her tailored suit crisp, her voice steady as she introduced Dr. Claire Nguyen, a data analyst with a calm demeanor and a folder of documents. Dr. Nguyen will clarify the source of Ms. Leavitt's jobs report, Pam said, her words measured but firm. Caroline's heart lifted, a knot loosening in her chest. Someone was finally listening. Dr. Nguyen, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense ponytail, stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She opened her folder and began, her voice clear and unhurried. Ms. Leavitt's report aligns with a private sector study conducted by my firm, not federal records. The numbers are consistent, verified, and publicly accessible. The gallery erupted in whispers, a wave of surprise rolling through the crowd. Reporters' phones lit up, their screens glowing as they posted live updates. Expert backs Leavitt's data in courtroom showdown. Spectators leaned forward, some nodding, others frowning, caught off guard by the shift. Emily, the junior clerk in her gray suit, sat near the back, her notepad open, her eyes fixed on Dr. Nguyen. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the truth was finally taking shape. Caroline noticed, her breath catching. Emily's quiet support felt like a small victory, a crack in the wall of indifference. Caroline's fingers traced the initials on her father's notebook, her mind drifting to the late nights she'd spent poring over data, her father's voice in her ear. Numbers don't lie, but people do. He'd been a data analyst, meticulous and principled, and she'd followed his path, choosing facts over politics. That choice had led her here, to a courtroom where her integrity was under fire, but Dr. Nguyen's testimony was a lifeline, a confirmation that her work wasn't a lie. Caroline's eyes met Pam's, and Pam's steady gaze held a silent promise. "We're not done." It was the same look Pam had given her years ago, when Karoline was an intern, nervous and eager, learning to navigate a world that rewarded flash over substance. Pam had believed in her then, and she believed in her now. If you've ever felt the relief of someone standing by you when the world turned away, this was that moment. Hargrove, the prosecutor, rose from his table, his sharp features twisted in frustration. "This is absurd, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice thinner than before. "Dr. Nguyen's firm has ties to conservative think tanks. Her testimony is biased, a clear attempt to muddy the waters." He gestured wildly, his tie askew, but his words lacked their earlier venom. The gallery murmured, some spectators shaking their heads, others typing furiously. Social media was ablaze, hashtags like Free Karoline trending as the public caught wind of the twist. Dr. Nguyen didn't flinch, her response calm and precise. "My firm's study is peer-reviewed and transparent. The data speaks for itself." Karoline's heart swelled, a quiet pride mingling with her relief. She'd chosen that study for its rigor, not its politics, and now it was her shield. Judge Whitaker, high on his bench, looked unsteady, his silver hair catching the light as he shifted in his chair. His confidence, so unshakable earlier, was waning, his pen no longer tapping but clutched tightly in his hand. He'd built his case against Karoline on the assumption that her youth and inexperience made her an easy target, a political pawn to be disciplined. But Pam's intervention and Dr. Nguyen's testimony had shifted the ground beneath him. The gallery was no longer his audience. They were Karoline's. Emily, the clerk, scribbled faster now, her earlier hesitation gone. Other spectators whispered, their phones buzzing with notifications. The story was spreading, no longer confined to this room. Karoline felt the shift, a subtle turning of the tide. But she kept her face composed, her father's words echoing truth weights. But it never hides, just as victory seemed within reach. Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the buzz. "This court will not be swayed by last-minute theatrics," he said, his tone sharp but strained. "Ms. Leavitt's conduct still suggests obstruction of court procedure." "I'm considering an additional charge," the gallery gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed off the walls. Karoline's stomach dropped, her brief hope flickering. Hargrove smirked, regaining some of his swagger, while Pam's expression didn't waver, her eyes narrowing slightly. Emily stopped writing, her pen frozen, her gaze darting to Karoline. The reporters typed faster, the story growing. Judge doubles down on Leavitt. Despite evidence. Karoline's fingers tightened around her notebook, her pulse racing. Was this Whitaker's desperate bid to save face, or a trap to bury her deeper? The recess stretched on, the room humming with uncertainty, and Karoline wondered what Pam had left to play. The Virginia Federal Courthouse. Room 4 crackled with a tense stillness as the recess ended, the oak-paneled walls seeming to hold their breath. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer now slightly wrinkled, her hands resting lightly on her father's leather notebook, its frayed edges warm under her fingers. The room felt different now, charged with a fragile hope, but Karoline's heart still raced, a quiet fear lingering beneath her resolve. Pam Bondi's evidence had shifted the tide, but Judge Whitaker's new charge, obstruction of court procedure, loomed like a shadow, a last grasp at control. The gallery was packed, reporters poised with laptops, spectators whispering, their phones buzzing with updates. Emily, the junior clerk in her gray suit, sat near the back, her notepad clutched tightly, her eyes flickering with something new, guilt, perhaps, or courage. Karoline noticed, her breath steadying. If you've ever faced a moment where silence could save you but truth demanded more, this was that moment. Pam Bondi stood at the podium, her tailored suit sharp, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have evidence that calls into question the integrity of this proceeding," she said, her voice calm but cutting. The gallery leaned forward, the air tightening. Pam held up a small USB drive, its black casing unremarkable but heavy with promise. "This is a recorded call, obtained legally, in which Judge Whitaker pressured a court clerk to suppress Ms. Leavitt's audit evidence." The courtroom fell silent, a hush so deep it seemed to swallow sound. Karoline's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. She hadn't known about this, hadn't dared hope for something so damning. Whitaker's face drained of color, his silver hair stark against his paling skin. He gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white, his earlier smugness gone. Hargrove, the prosecutor, shot to his feet, his voice shrill. "This is outrageous! That recording is inadmissible, a violation of protocol." But his words faltered, his sharp features twisting in panic. Pam didn't flinch, her response measured. "The recording was provided by a whistleblower within this court. Your Honor, its authenticity is verifiable." Before Whitaker could respond, Emily, the clerk, stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. The gallery turned, gasps rippling through the crowd. Emily's hands trembled, but her voice, though soft, carried. "I overheard that call," she said, her eyes darting to Whitaker, then to Karoline. "I was in the clerk's office when it happened. I stayed quiet because I was scared. But I couldn't let this go on." Karoline's eyes glistened, a warmth spreading in her chest. She hadn't expected an ally, least of all Emily, whose silence had felt like betrayal hours ago. Pam inserted the USB drive into a laptop, and the audio played. Whitaker's voice unmistakable, low and insistent. "Make sure those audit papers don't surface. They're a distraction." The words echoed, cold and deliberate, exposing a man who'd bent the law to protect his pride. Hargrove's face paled, his hands fumbling with his notes. Whitaker slumped in his seat, his robes pooling around him like a deflated shield. The gallery exploded, voices rising, reporters rushing out to file stories, their phones flashing with notifications. Social media erupted, hashtags like "Justice for Karoline" trending as the public seized the moment. Karoline stood, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. She spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the chaos. "I didn't come to fight. I came to end the lies." The words were simple, but they landed like a vow, a quiet power that silenced the room. Karoline's fingers brushed her father's notebook, its leather grounding her as she thought of him, his steady hands, his belief in truth over vengeance. He'd taught her to stand tall, not to shout. And now, in this moment, she felt his presence, a quiet strength guiding her. Pam's eyes met hers, a flicker of pride in her mentor's gaze. Emily sat down, her face flushed but relieved, as if unburdening herself had lifted a weight. The other spectators were no longer passive. They whispered, nodded, some even clapping softly, their earlier indifference replaced by awe. Reporters typed furiously, their stories shifting Judge exposed in Leavitt case. Outside, news vans gathered, their antennas piercing the Virginia sky, the story spreading far beyond the courthouse walls. Whitaker raised a hand, his voice weak, trying to regain control. "This court will review the evidence," he said. But the words lacked force, his authority crumbling. Hargrove sat, his head bowed, his earlier bravado gone. Karoline's heart pounded, not with triumph, but with a bittersweet clarity. She'd chosen to speak, to risk everything, because silence would have meant betraying her father's legacy, her own integrity. The truth was out, ringing like a bell, but the cost was real months of scrutiny, a name dragged through headlines, a career teetering. Yet, as she looked at Emily, at Pam, at the gallery now alive with support, she felt a quiet strength. The room buzzed, the air electric with change, but Whitaker's next move was unclear. How would he face the fallout of his own words? And what would it mean for Karoline, the Virginia federal courthouse? Room 4 felt quieter now, its oak-paneled walls softened by the late afternoon light filtering through high windows. Karoline Leavitt stood at the defendant's table, her navy blazer hanging loosely on her frame, her hands no longer clutching her father's leather notebook but resting gently on it, as if it had carried her through the storm. The gavel struck softly, almost reluctantly as Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice a shadow of its earlier force. All charges against Ms. Leavitt are dismissed, he said, his silver hair dull under the fluorescent glow, his eyes avoiding hers. The gallery exhaled, a collective release of tension, followed by a swell of murmurs. Reporters typed furiously, their screens flashing with headlines, "Leavitt vindicated in courtroom drama." Karoline's knees trembled, her chest tight with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She'd won, but the victory felt heavy, like a stone smoothed by years of struggle. Pam Bondi, standing beside her, handed Karoline a tissue, her touch brief but warm. Karoline took it, wiping her eyes. The tears coming not from sadness but from the weight of everything months of scrutiny, the sting of Whitaker's contempt, the fear of losing her name to a lie. Pam's presence was a steady anchor, her mentor's quiet strength a reminder of the intern she'd once been, eager and unafraid. The gallery was alive now, spectators whispering, some clapping softly, their earlier indifference replaced by admiration. Emily, the junior clerk in her gray suit, lingered near the back, her notepad closed, her face soft with something like regret. Karoline caught her eye, and Emily offered a shy smile, a silent apology for her earlier silence. The moment felt fragile, a bridge built on shared truth. As the courtroom emptied, Karoline followed Pam into the hallway, the marble floor cool under her shoes, the air sharp with the scent of polish and coffee. The crowd outside was louder now, their chants of Karoline, Karoline echoing through the glass doors. News vans lined the street, their cameras flashing, but Karoline felt distant from it all, her heart still tethered to the quiet moments that had brought her here. Emily approached, her steps hesitant, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner," she said, her eyes meeting Karoline's. "I was scared. But you made me want to be braver." Karoline nodded, her throat tight, and opened her father's notebook to a page she'd read 100 times. His handwriting steady, stand tall, even when alone. She smiled faintly, the words a gift she now shared with Emily. Pam, standing nearby, leaned in, her voice low. "I filed an ethics complaint against Whitaker this morning," she said, her eyes sharp but calm. "It's already under review by the judicial board." Karoline's breath caught, a spark of justice igniting in her chest. Pam had been planning this, moving pieces while Karoline stood in the fire. The complaint wasn't vengeance, it was accountability, a step toward ensuring no one else faced Whitaker's bias. The hallway buzzed with reporters, one pushing forward, his microphone outstretched. "Ms. Leavitt." "What now?" he asked, his voice eager. Karoline paused, her fingers brushing her father's notebook, her mind clear. "I'll keep going," she said, her smile faint but steady, a promise to herself, to her father, to the truth she'd fought for. And that was when the truth didn't need to shout anymore. The crowd outside grew louder, their voices a wave of support, but Karoline's victory was bittersweet. She'd fought not for fame, not for headlines, but for the quiet certainty that her work, her father's legacy, was worth defending. The reporters scribbled, their stories shifting Leavitt's triumph sparks ethics probe. Social media buzzed, hashtags like Justice for Karoline joined by new ones hold judges accountable. Spectators lingered, some approaching to shake her hand, others nodding from a distance. Their faces softened by respect. Emily stood nearby, her notepad tucked under her arm, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet resolve. Pam's hand rested briefly on Karoline's shoulder, a gesture that said more than words could. Karoline thought of her mother, probably watching the news at home, her hands clasped in relief. She thought of her father, gone 3 years but present in every choice she'd made today. The notebook in her hand felt lighter now, its pages a testament to the man who'd taught her that truth was a quiet power, not a loud one. If you've ever carried a weight for someone you loved, fought a battle not for yourself but for what's right, this moment was for you. The hallway hummed with life, the crowd's chants fading as Karoline and Pam stepped toward the exit. Whitaker remained in his chambers, his silence deafening, his next move uncertain. Would he fight the complaint? Or had the truth already broken him? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maymont Park in Richmond, Virginia, its sprawling lawns dotted with dogwood trees and the soft ripple of a nearby fountain. Karoline Leavitt walked slowly along a gravel path, her navy blazer replaced by a simple gray sweater, her father's leather notebook tucked safely in her shoulder bag. A week had passed since the courtroom battle, and though her steps were lighter, the memory of that day lingered like a bruise, tender but fading. The air smelled of fresh grass and distant rain, a quiet contrast to the sterile tension of the Virginia federal courthouse. Karoline's hands were loose at her sides, her breath even, but her heart carried a bittersweet weight relief tempered by the cost of her fight. She'd cleared her name, but the journey had left her older, wiser, her faith in fairness both tested and renewed. News had broken that morning Judge Whitaker had retired quietly, his ethics complaint still pending before the judicial board. The announcement was brief, buried in the local paper's 3rd page, but it sent ripples through Virginia's legal circles. Karoline had read it over coffee, her mother's hand squeezing hers across the kitchen table. No words needed. The courthouse memo on transparency, issued days later, was a small but real change, a nod to the storm she'd weathered. Reporters now called her a symbol of resilience, their stories sparking debates on judicial fairness, their headlines softer but no less potent. Leavitt's stand prompts court reform. Social media hummed with her name, hashtags like Justice for Karoline joined by quieter ones Speak Your Truth. Karoline didn't read them all. The attention felt distant, like a song she'd once loved but no longer needed. She paused by the fountain, its water catching the sunlight in brief, dazzling arcs. The park was alive with families, joggers and couples, their laughter a gentle hum that wrapped around her. Karoline sat on a wrought iron bench, her bag resting beside her. The notebook swayed a quiet comfort. She thought of her father, his steady voice, his belief that truth was a seed, not a shout. He'd been gone 3 years, but his lessons lived in her, in the way she'd stood tall in that courtroom, not for glory but for what was right. If you've ever been doubted for who you are, felt your name twisted by someone else's judgment, Karoline's story is yours. She didn't seek revenge, didn't crave Whitaker's downfall. She'd let truth stand tall. And it had been enough. A young woman approached, her sneakers crunching on the gravel, her face hesitant but warm. She was in her 20s, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Ms. Leavitt?" she asked, on her voice soft. Karoline looked up, her smile instinctive. "Karoline," she corrected gently. The woman nodded, her hands twisting together. I saw you on the news. What you did. It inspired me to speak up at my job. I was scared, but I did it because of you." Caroline's throat tightened, a warmth spreading in her chest. She thought of Emily, the clerk who'd found her voice, of Pam, who'd fought without hesitation. "You were brave," Caroline said, her voice steady. "That's what matters." The woman smiled, her eyes bright, and walked away, her steps lighter. Caroline leaned back, the bench cool against her shoulders. The fountains murmur a soothing rhythm. She thought of her mother, now planning a quiet dinner to celebrate. Of Pam, who'd called yesterday to check in, her voice warm with pride. The courthouse felt far away, its walls no longer confining her. Whitaker's retirement was a footnote, his silence a confession of its own. The ethics complaint would run its course, but Caroline didn't need its verdict to feel whole. She'd fought for her father's legacy, for the data that told real stories of real lives, for the truth she'd always believed in. The park stretched out before her, its colors vivid in the fading light, a reminder that life went on, carrying her forward. A breeze stirred, lifting a strand of hair across her face, and Caroline brushed it away, her fingers grazing her bag. She didn't open the notebook, didn't need to. Its words were part of her now, the young woman's words echoed in her mind, a reminder that her fight had touched others, had planted seeds she'd never see grow. Sometimes, the loudest truths are spoken softly, and they echo far beyond the courtroom. Caroline stood, her bag slung over her shoulder, and walked toward the park's exit, the fountain's song fading behind her. The world was waiting, and she was ready to meet it, not as a headline, but as herself. What would her next step bring, and who else might it inspire? Caroline's hand rested on her father's notebook, its pages still, as the fountain's soft hum filled the air. There was no applause, just a quiet shift in the park's evening light, like the world taking a breath. Did justice need a shout to be heard? Sometimes the loudest truths are the ones spoken softly. They linger, not in headlines, but in the courage of those who choose to stand, even when no one else does.